Imagine a horror film where the most terrifying villain isn't a demon or a maniac, but your own community. This wasn't a movie set. It was 14th century Europe. In one brutal instance, an innocent woman was stripped bare and pulled through the cobbled lanes. Her own flesh and blood, her children, were forced to participate, throwing jagged stones at her face. Her supposed crime? Nothing more than an unsubstantiated whisper, a baseless rumor. There was no judicial hearing, no proof demanded, just an instant, violent transformation of neighbors into a furious mob of executioners. But what followed this initial public assault was so profoundly repulsive, so utterly psychologically toxic, that the clergy presiding over the event were documented as physically ill. They vomited. This isn't historical fiction designed to shock. It is the documented reality of the medieval period, repeated across the continent thousands of times. The precise methodologies employed to break these women were so cruelly effective that they are still analyzed by modern experts on coercion and interrogation today. Over the next several minutes, we are going to expose the factual legal decrees, the preserved court records, and the appalling witness accounts that reveal a mechanism of control so precisely calibrated, so openly dramatic, and so ruthlessly vicious that it makes contemporary slasher films seem infantile. And here is the most chilling detail. The architects of these systemic cruelties were not sociopathic deviants. They were esteemed public officials, church leaders, and legislators who genuinely believed their actions were divinely inspired, a sacred duty. Make sure to subscribe to this channel for more deep dives into the terrifying realities of history, and let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. Stay tuned, because by the time this video concludes, you will understand why one prominent historian labeled this era the most systematic annihilation of the female form in the entire sweep of European history. Be forewarned, the evidence you are about to hear violates fundamental ethical boundaries. Before we detail the specific violent acts, a crucial context must be established. This persecution was not random violence. It was a highly engineered system. This carefully constructed apparatus of fear operated seamlessly across centuries and geopolitical borders, from the snow-dusted hamlets of Scandinavia to the sun-scorched plazas of Iberia. In this rigidly controlled society, a woman's physical self was never sovereign. The instant she accepted a marriage contract, she legally ceased to exist as an individual. Jurists classified her as femme covert, literally a covered woman. Her identity and her assets subsumed entirely under her husband's ownership. Like any valuable chattel, any perceived fault or flaw was considered a violation against the owner, not the woman herself. An act of adultery transcended a mere breach of a marital promise. It became a form of economic sabotage. She was seen as committing fraud, generating illegitimate heirs, and fundamentally undermining a man's single most precious asset, the assured purity of his bloodline. Consider the immense financial implications of this concept. In a pre-modern world lacking any form of genetic or forensic certainty, no DNA testing, no certified records, a man's only guarantee that his children were truly his was the absolute, enforced sexual exclusivity of his wife. Her sexual transgression did not just damage his reputation. It represented a direct financial threat, potentially diverting his entire estate to a competing lineage. Such a betrayal could dismantle powerful family compacts and even void diplomatic agreements between principalities. Therefore, the official response had to be proportionate to this catastrophic existential risk. This is where the truth becomes truly grim. These rituals of punishment were not intended simply to chastise one woman. They were designed to transmit an unforgettable shockwave across entire populations. Their goal was to produce such vivid, enduring public trauma that every woman in every village would carry the dreadful images in her mind, a permanent mental scar. The calculated cruelty was the intended result. The overwhelming terror was the intended social communication. And here is the deeply troubling corollary. The municipalities that carried out these spectacles were not populated by inherently evil individuals. They were populated by entirely normal people who had been socially conditioned to accept this extreme violence against women as not only permissible, but morally required, righteous, and even pious. We begin with the penalty that was paradoxically considered the mildest. They labeled it the carting or the penitent's promenade. These gentle labels concealed a process that was, in reality, pure psychological warfare masquerading as a judicial process. The first instrument in this war was the systematic defacement. Imagine being a citizen in a 14th century Germanic town. Well before sunrise, the law enforcement officers breach your dwelling. They ensure your apprehension is maximally disruptive, ensuring your children are forced to observe as you are dragged toward the central square, where a crude wooden seat has been erected. A town barber, perhaps the same man who trimmed your husband's beard for years, approaches with large shears. His objective is not a simple haircut. Historical logs from Augsburg explicitly detail the intention to make the shaving as hideous as possible. They would intentionally leave rough clumps, lacerate the scalp, ensuring the woman looked not merely denuded, but monstrous, almost diseased. One horrifying 1487 record describes a woman pleading with them to at least make the cutting even, only for the gathered crowd to erupt in mockery. Her absolute degradation was their communal amusement. But this act of defilement served a deeper symbolic function. In medieval thought, a woman's hair represented her inherent feminine glory, her identity, her crown. Joan of Arc faced heresy charges partly for adopting a masculine cut. For a married woman, her neatly veiled or bound hair symbolized her conjugal fidelity and her humility. To sever it was to annul her womanhood, to strip away not merely her locks, but her entire social standing. Next came the stripping. This stage was especially deliberate. In some jurisdictions, she was permitted to wear a flimsy undergarment, a thin shift. However, in regions like England and large parts of France, the statute explicitly required total nudity. Why this extreme exhibition? Because the public exposure of the female form was considered more than merely shameful, it was thought to be spiritually polluting. It transformed her into a literal walking contagion, an object that corrupted the very atmosphere she passed through. Now, the true psychological torment commenced. She was not simply marched through arbitrary avenues. She deliberately walked past her own residence, the church where her vows were taken, the marketplace where she conducted her daily business, and the homes of lifelong acquaintances. At every stage, the throng expanded. But here is the most diabolical dimension of the punishment. Attendance was often mandatory. Municipal ledgers from numerous cities document that residents could be legally penalized for refusing to witness these parades. Your neighbors, your peers, people you had shared meals with were legally coerced to be present. And many went far beyond mere observation. Court narratives describe participants throwing not just spoiled produce, but heavy stones, sludge mixed with human waste, and decaying animal parts. A horrifying report from Tuscany in 1342 recounts a woman who lost an eye after being struck by a jagged bone fragment. Another account details a pregnant woman who suffered a spontaneous miscarriage due to extreme physical and psychological distress. The governing authorities offered no protection. This was the desired outcome. The procession could endure for many hours. In large municipalities, the longest possible route was chosen, sometimes forcing the woman to march for 7 hours under a scorching sun or through bitter rain. Some victims collapsed. Others descended into hysterical madness in the street, their incoherent shrieks only amplifying the theatricality. Then came the final act of malice, the return. She would be released at her own front door, where she usually discovered her husband had already bolted the entrance. Her children had been instructed to shun her. Often, her household goods would be stacked in the thoroughfare, already being claimed by opportunistic neighbors. But the consequences did not vanish then. This is what made the ritual so utterly crushing. A woman who endured the ceremony was irreversibly branded. She was disqualified from remarriage, prevented from seeking honest employment, and forced to sit in a designated penitence section in the local church. One Parisian chronicler described a woman who, a full 15 years after her public penance, was still immediately identified on the street and publicly spat upon. This was social assassination by decree, and yet it was regarded as the merciful alternative. Because when an accusation lacked sufficient proof, the state had something far worse reserved: the trial by ordeal. Even the terminology sounds archaic and savagely cruel to the modern ear. But the key to understanding this is realization. For the people of medieval Europe, this was not brutality. They sincerely believed this represented the ultimate articulation of divine justice. They were convinced that God would physically intervene to protect the righteous and condemn the wicked, which makes the actual consequences even more terrifying. The most standard ordeal reserved for suspected adulteresses was the trial by cold water. The theological justification for this test reveals a form of chilling, inverted logic. The water employed was not ordinary. It was sanctified by a priest, often drawn directly from the baptismal font. The reasoning proceeded thus. Since water was used in baptism to cleanse sin and integrate the individual into God's grace, it would naturally repel a sinner. Pure water would refuse impure flesh. Here is the step-by-step procedure. Based on exhaustive records from dozens of jurisdictions in Germany, France, and England, the woman would be escorted to a pond, a river, or a specially constructed cistern, typically at dawn. The entire populace was commanded to attend, again compulsory witnessing. A clergyman would perform an elaborate blessing, imploring God to manifest his judgment. The woman was stripped to her chemise. Then, and this is explicitly codified in legal texts like the Saxonspiegel, Saxon Mirror, she was bound in a precise, debilitating manner. They would tie her right thumb to her left big toe and her left thumb to her right big toe, contorting her body into a position that made any attempt at floating or swimming utterly impossible. Some regions added a tether around her midsection. But here is the critical factual detail. That rope, the one tied around the bound woman, was not a safety line. It was a recovery tool, designed purely to retrieve the corpse after the ritual was complete. Bound hand to foot, the accused was either violently hurled into the sanctified pool or forced to leap in herself as the entire village watched in silence. Now, let's examine the grim biology of this spectacle. The ability of a human body to float, its buoyancy, is a delicate equation involving variables like lung volume, adipose tissue distribution, and water temperature. A woman gripped by sheer terror, breathing shallowly and erratically, might initially surface. If her body remained on top, floating, she was instantly deemed guilty, having been rejected by the purifying holy water. She would be immediately dragged from the edge and summarily executed, often right there on the bank. But if she plummeted, sank, she was declared innocent, accepted by the water's cleansing embrace. The terrifying paradox. A bound woman who sinks cannot surface, cannot breathe, and will inevitably drown. Judicial records show shocking inconsistency in how long officials permitted the sinking to proceed. Some documents suggest a wait of mere seconds. Others cite protocols requiring the presiding priest to recite an entire, lengthy prayer, a delay that could easily consume 5 minutes or more. Consider the documented case from 1194 England. A woman named Edith faced accusations from her husband's own brother. She was subjected to the cold water trial. The surviving chronicle states she sank like a rock and was only hauled out seconds from death. She was formally declared innocent. However, the severe oxygen deprivation had resulted in irreversible brain damage, and she expired just 3 days later. The record notes that her husband was instructed to arrange a Christian funeral, having been cleared by God's own judgment. Pause for a moment and consider the unimaginable psychological agony. Your life hangs on a random interaction between your body fat and water density. Either result spells death, one by execution, the other by divine accident. You are forced to believe that the Creator is watching, judging, and will personally intervene on your behalf. If you drown while innocent, does this mean God betrayed you? If you float and are killed, did God actively seek your damnation? The trial by cold water was not universally applied. In certain continental regions, they utilized the far more excruciating trial by hot iron. The accused was compelled to carry a piece of glowing, incandescent metal for a prescribed distance, typically 9 deliberate paces. Her injured hands were immediately wrapped in linen bandages. After a mandatory 3-day wait, the wraps were meticulously removed. If the wound was observed to be healing cleanly, she was declared innocent. If, however, the wound showed any signs of pus or sepsis, an almost guaranteed outcome given the state of medieval medicine, she was found guilty. One deeply disturbing 12th century record from Bavaria details a woman who frantically offered to confess, begging to avoid the iron. She was coldly informed that a confession without the trial would mandate a harsher sentence, mutilation instead of simple execution. She chose the iron. The resulting infection was so severe that her hands had to be amputated. She succumbed to sepsis within the week. The court used the fatal infection as conclusive proof of guilt and denied her a Christian burial. Here is the sickest twist of irony. These ordeals were eventually outlawed by the highest authority, the Catholic Church itself, at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. This ban was not motivated by compassion for the suffering women. It was because the Church concluded that forcing God to perform miracles on demand was theologically irrelevant. It was considered disrespectful to the Almighty. The suffering of the accused was secondary. The propriety of the ritual was paramount. Yet, even after the official prohibition, the ordeal systems persisted in many distant areas for another century or more, sometimes simply rebranded as judicial tests rather than sacred rituals. The relentless cycle of terror continued. Women drowned or burned, and everyone reassured themselves that flawless justice had been served. If you find this level of historical control over women shocking, hit the like button to help us keep bringing these untold stories to light. As horrific as these ordeals were, they carried a sliver of plausible deniability. The death could be attributed to divine judgment or accident. The next phase of punishment was engineered to eliminate any ambiguity. It was designed to ensure not just survival, but a life so degraded you would desire death. To understand the medieval state, you must grasp its fixation on permanent physical markers. In a time of mass illiteracy, when records were scarce and identity was visual, branding a person's body was the ultimate indelible record. For the crime of adultery, the physical marking was engineered to be instantaneously recognizable. The ancient statutes are terrifyingly clear. The laws of King Nut, which governed early 11th century England and Scandinavia, explicitly mandated, "An adulteress shall have her nose and ears cut off." This was not a discretionary penalty. It was the required default sentence. Let's reconstruct the cold reality of this statute. Based on surgical procedure accounts and court documents, the mutilations were carried out as follows. The woman was dragged to the public square. She might be lashed to a wooden post or forcibly restrained by several men. A barber or blacksmith, the individuals possessing the sharpest tools and steady hands, would operate. There was no anesthetic, not even a strong drink to dull the sensation. In fact, in some areas, offering the woman anything to bite on was forbidden because her screams were considered an essential component of the public demonstration. The nose was typically severed first, not just the cartilage tip, but the entire structure cut back to the facial bone. The loss of blood was catastrophic. Victims frequently choked on their own blood, hence they were often held facing downward. The ears were removed next, either partially or fully, based on local tradition. Subsequently, the raw wounds were cauterized with a searing hot iron to stop the flow. The stench of charring flesh permeated the square. The woman's agonizing cries echoed off the surrounding buildings. The assembled crowd watched, compelled to witness the fate awaiting any female who dared to stray. Here is a specific, damning example from a 1231 German town. A woman named Gertrude was accused by her spouse of intimacy with a traveling merchant. He had no evidence beyond his personal suspicion and the claim of one neighbor who saw them speaking privately. Under local ordinance, this flimsy evidence was sufficient for conviction. Gertrude's nose and ears were surgically removed. The chronicler mentions, almost parenthetically, that her 3 young children, all under 7, witnessed the mutilation. It is noted that her youngest daughter wept inconsolably for many days afterward. Gertrude survived the initial physical trauma, but here is her devastating aftermath. Her husband was automatically granted a divorce. She was left without any means of support. Her disfigurement rendered her utterly unemployable. No one would hire a woman so visibly scarred. She could not even sustain herself through begging, as her appearance terrified and repulsed people. Within 6 months, the same record reports her body was discovered in a ditch outside the settlement. The cause of death was assumed to be starvation. No legal inquiry followed. Her death was legally nobody's fault. The function of these mutilations transcended the punishment of one woman. Every mutilated victim became a living, breathing warning. A piece of ambulatory propaganda proclaiming, "This is the ultimate price of marital betrayal," because the injury was so unique. Missing ears and a severed nose. Everyone who encountered these women knew their precise crime. There was no anonymity, no possibility of a fresh start in another town. The punishment followed them to the grave. Some areas employed local variants. In parts of Italy, women were branded with hot irons, typically on the cheek or forehead, with the letter A for adulteress. In France, some tribunals ordered the shearing of hair followed by the slicing of the tongue, particularly if the woman had vociferously protested her innocence. The medical reality adds a layer of horror. Most women who died from these mutilations did not die instantly, but from severe infection and sepsis in the days and weeks following. Medieval healers lacked any concept of antiseptic care. The open wounds became polluted, fever set in, and slow, agonizing septic shock killed them. Legally, however, this was not deemed an execution. The woman had been justly penalized, and her subsequent death was ruled as God's final decision. Here is the most deeply unsettling discovery from my archival research. Financial ledger books from several medieval towns contain documented payments made to the barber or executioner who carried out these mutilations. They were paid a fee per procedure. The systematic destruction of a woman's identity was disturbingly codified, even down to a ledger. In one documented town in Flanders, the cost for bodily mutilation was itemized. A payment of 3 shillings for a nose and 2 shillings for each ear. They operated with a literal price sheet for the methodical destruction of women's faces. Yet, mutilation, while permanently devastating, was typically the penalty reserved for commoners and the lower merchant class. For women of noble birth, those shielded by significant family power and political influence, the medieval judiciary conceived of something arguably more insidious. A punishment designed for slow, silent psychological destruction spanning years, perhaps even decades. This grim reality burst into public consciousness in 1314 with the Tour de Nesle affair, one of the most explosive royal scandals in French history. The fate of the principal women involved revealed the most sophisticated psychological torture device in the European legal arsenal: perpetual solitary enclosure. Margaret and Blanche of Burgundy were wives to the future monarchs of France. They were apprehended, or at least credibly accused, of infidelity. The historical evidence remains ambiguous, but the consequences were immediate and absolute. Their male paramours were subjected to gruesome public execution, being flayed alive and brutally dismembered before the public. For the 2 royal women, however, death would have been a relative mercy. Instead, their sentence was a living oblivion, lifetime imprisonment within the separate confines of a fortress. This is what that sentence actually meant. Based on forensic examinations of architectural plans and surviving chronicles, Margaret was locked inside the Chateau Gallard in a cell specifically prepared for her internment. The space was claustrophobic, measuring roughly 10 feet by 10 feet. The walls were constructed of massively thick stone. Her only connection to the outside world was a single, narrow slit of a window, placed too high to reach and too slender for any human body to pass through. The massive iron-studded door was sealed shut, with only a small hatch at the bottom, through which a single meal was pushed once per day. She was permitted no visitors, no written communication, and no news of the world she had lost. Her only human interaction was with the silent guard who slipped the food tray through the hatch. She was denied books, largely because women of her rank were not formally educated to read, but even if she could, none were supplied. Candles were forbidden beyond the minimal light needed for eating. There were no writing materials, nothing whatsoever to track the inexorable flow of time except the delivery of food and the slow daily shift of light from that high, narrow window. Margaret perished in her cell after 8 years. She was just 30 years old. The court record simply states she died of natural causes. Modern historians strongly suspect suicide, or the cumulative physical toll of long-term isolation, nutritional deficiency, untreated sickness, or simply the body's final surrender under the extreme pressure of psychological annihilation. Blanche's ordeal lasted longer. She survived 11 years of solitary confinement before being transferred to a convent, where she remained until her death, still isolated. By the time she died, she had spent more of her adult life in captivity than she had in freedom. However, the noble status of the Tour de Nesle women afforded them a baseline of physical comfort: a bed, blankets, and adequate noble fare. For merchant-class women and others across Europe convicted of adultery, the reality was often exponentially worse. A horrifying practice documented across multiple regions was immurement, the act of being literally walled up alive. While rare, it was not unheard of. A woman would be forced into a tiny cell, sometimes scarcely large enough for her to sit upright, and the entrance would then be systematically bricked over, leaving only a minuscule opening for the passage of food and the removal of waste. She was consigned to live out the remainder of her days in this tomb, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades. In 1357, a woman named Maria in Barcelona was convicted and sentenced to immurement in a cell constructed directly into the city wall. The contemporary account describes the space as so small that she could not fully stretch out. She survived in this concrete coffin for 9 years before she died. The record chillingly notes that her screams were audible for the first several months, followed by a profound, unbroken silence. When the cell was finally breached to extract her body, they found she had scratched desperate, final messages into the solid stone walls using her fingernails, which were worn down to bloody, raw stumps. The messages were a mix of frantic prayers and bitter curses. This is just a fraction of the cruelty sanctioned by medieval law. If this content is gripping you, please take a moment to smash the like button. It helps YouTube recognize the value of uncovering these difficult historical truths. The psychological impact of this level of extreme sensory deprivation is an area that modern researchers are still grappling with. Solitary confinement exceeding 15 days is now globally recognized as a form of torture by human rights organizations. These women endured this state for months, years, and sometimes decades. And here is the most profound moral perversion. This slow, living burial was officially considered merciful. It was deliberately framed as granting the woman time to repent, to reconcile herself with God before her eventual death. Her agonizing suffering was recast as spiritual cleansing. The clergy instructed that she should be grateful for the opportunity to contemplate her sins in solitude. Inevitably, some women lost their minds. Chronicle entries recount victims who stopped eating, who violently battered their heads against the stone walls, or who descended into incomprehensible babbling when food was delivered. But there was no psychiatric aid, no intervention. The madness was interpreted as either demonic possession, divine punishment, or the final stage of spiritual purgation before death. This silencing was entirely deliberate. These were women who had held social influence and been visible in society. Their enclosure eradicated them not just physically, but from the historical record itself. Many were denied burial in consecrated ground. Their names were systematically erased from family genealogies. They were made into non-persons. All of this, the mutilation, the drowning, the public shaming, the living burial, was justified by the same core legal framework. A framework that brings us to the final, most infuriating truth about medieval justice. Now, let's turn our attention to the men. While women were being publicly destroyed, drowned, mutilated, and bricked up alive for adultery, what was the corresponding fate of the men they allegedly slept with? The answer is enraging in its simplicity. A fine. In many cases, it was a fine. Occasionally, it was temporary banishment. In rare circumstances, they might face a minor public penance, such as wearing a penitential garment or offering a donation to the church. That was it. The double standard was not a legal oversight. It was deliberately codified into the law. The Saxonspiegel, one of the most authoritative medieval legal codes, acknowledged that both men and women could be penalized for adultery. But here was the essential loophole. A man's action only constituted adultery if he was sleeping with another man's wife. If he were a bachelor, or if the woman were unmarried, it was legally downgraded to fornication, a minor offense requiring only religious confession. But for the woman, any sexual contact outside marriage was automatically defined as adultery, period. The crime was never truly about the moral act itself. It was fundamentally about the violation of male property rights. Even in the isolated instances where men faced nominal punishment, avenues for escape were plentiful. The nobility could simply pay a financial penalty. Men had the right to invoke trial by combat, where they would physically fight their accuser, a right strictly forbidden to women. Wealthy men could even hire professional substitutes to fight on their behalf. The entire legal scaffolding was engineered with escape hatches for men that women could not access. And here is the most galling hypocrisy. The men who actively participated in the punishment process, the magistrates, the torturers, the priests who sanctified the drowning water, and the very crowds who hurled the stones, were statistically likely to have been adulterers themselves. Research into surviving court records reveals countless instances where men sitting in judgment over adulteresses were themselves later found to have maintained mistresses, patronized brothels, or fathered children out of wedlock. The hypocrisy was not a flaw. It was the foundation of the system. The relentless cruelty was the point, and the message was absolutely clear. Women's bodies were not their own. Female sexuality was a resource that had to be rigidly contained, regulated, and brutally suppressed whenever it deviated from the strict confines of male ownership. These were not isolated acts of sadism. They were systematic, legalized policies, executed with the absolute endorsement of both religious and secular power structures across Europe for centuries. Thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, of women endured these calculated horrors. Perhaps the most unsettling fact is how recently this history occurred. Modified versions of these public shaming practices persisted well into the 18th century and beyond. The culture of publicly shaming women for their sexual conduct has never truly vanished. It has merely modernized. If this deep dive into history has shaken you, that is the intention. Understanding how societies have systematically controlled, punished, and destroyed women throughout history is not merely about reciting the past. It is about actively recognizing the patterns that tragically echo in our world today. The shaming, the disproportionate victim blaming, and the fundamentally different standards applied to male and female sexuality. Drop a comment right now and tell me which specific part of this story, the price list for a nose, the immurement, or the legal double standard, shocked you the most. And if you want more uncompromising deep dives into the darkest corners of human history, subscribe now because there are many more uncomfortable truths we are committed to uncovering.